Here are my top 5 ETFs for building wealth in 2025. The year is coming to a close and the stock market had a year for the ages, with a lot of major indices being up north of 25%. But what ETFs will keep this momentum going for 2025? Of course, not financial advice, just my research and ETFs that I'm going to take a look at. The first ETF is ticker symbol VOO or VOO, a Vanguard ETF tracking the S&P 500. The S&P 500 tracks 500 of the biggest companies in the United States of America. Technology, financials, healthcare, manufacturing, consumer goods, anything that you can imagine is included in the S&P 500. Some of the bigger companies in the S&P 500 have been up multifold over the last decade. So if someone's investing in VOO, they're investing in a slice of the entire US economy. Why I like VOO in particular is because the expense ratio is extremely low at 0.03%. This is much lower than other ETF providers and will compound your growth much quicker in the long run. This essentially means that for every $1,000 you put, you're giving the ETF provider Vanguard only 30 cents in fees. It's also one of the most liquid ETFs in the United States and also has a dividend yield of 1.1%, although for our reasons for growth, dividends are not that important. I will have a similar list for the top dividend ETFs for the year coming soon. To sum it all up, VOO has returned 14.9% on average since 2010, an exceptional return. And if you do believe that the US economy is going to flourish in the future, VOO might be a good option to look at. The next ETF is ticker symbol QQQ, an Invesco product tracking the Nasdaq 100. Similarly to the S&P 500, the Nasdaq 100 is an ETF tracking 100 of the biggest companies listed on the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. This ETF is heavily tilted towards technology, healthcare, and consumer discretionary spending. The main goal of this ETF is to provide investors with exposure to high growth industries. As you'll notice, 50% or thereabouts of the entire ETF is focused on technology. And you also have communication services like Meta and Alphabet at roughly 15%. So that's the first word of warning here. If you think technology is not going to add value in the future, this might not be the right product for you. But if you think AI and other tech-focused industries like cybersecurity are going to add value in the future, QQQ is a good place to start. The expense ratio is extremely manageable at 0.2%, and it also has a decent dividend yield at around 0.5%. Given that it is extremely high growth, getting some dividend is not bad. I want to reiterate again, this is considered a high growth ETF. You'll notice that the growth rate for this ETF is 17.96% for the 10-year chart, which is around 4 percentage points better than the S&P 500 per year. So this might be more suited for tech enthusiasts like myself who are very interested in seeing what technology can do for us in terms of a productivity perspective and a consumer perspective in the future. The next ETF is ticker symbol VIG or VIG. This is the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation ETF. For this year, this ETF is up roughly 20.2% and holds companies that aggressively increase their dividends. Now, this might not entirely be a growth ETF, although a lot of the holdings are growth focused. For example, Apple, Microsoft, and Visa have been increasing earnings and revenue rapidly throughout the last decades. The key point to note is that the dividend yield is at 1.6%, and with a high growth rate, you can expect this yield to keep on increasing as that compound effect comes in. Essentially, this ETF tracks the S&P US Dividend Growers Index that contains companies that have been increasing dividends for 10 plus years. And because dividend growers can be in any sector, the sector allocation here is more diversified than a purely S&P 500 ETF, with industries like financials and healthcare making a significant portion of the ETF. You'll notice that the 10-year performance is actually not bad at around 11.84 or 12%, and given that 1.8% dividend yield, that is going to multiply in a decade or two. This actually might be a good investment opportunity for long-term investors like myself that have decades left in their working life where we accumulate capital to invest. So although there is a trade-off between growth and dividend appreciation, we need to utilize time to our side. If you have decades to invest, the dividend yield is going to multiply, and this 1.8% yield or 1.5% yield might be 3% or maybe more than that 2 or 3 decades from now. So that's why VIG is one of my top 5 ETFs for 2025. The fourth ETF, and perhaps the most risky one on this list, is ticker symbol SKYY or SKY. This ETF follows the ISE Cloud Computing Index and focuses on companies delivering cloud infrastructure or software as a service. Many businesses and companies over the last decade have moved on to what is called the cloud. But what is the cloud? It's essentially taking your technical operations from on-premise data storage and operations to 2, storage and operation managed by an external company, since it is technically supposed to be cheaper for you that way. Some of the biggest cloud companies include Microsoft with their Azure services, Google with Google Cloud, and also Amazon with AWS. And not just these companies, there's several other companies building on the cloud and providing that software as a service to businesses. This ETF is built on the premise that this is going to be a high growth industry in the future, with a lot of research predicting that the cloud market is going to be $1 trillion by 2030. And the sector allocation reflects that 70% of the entire ETF is information technology, with communication services coming in at around 15%. The three culprits that we've talked about are major holdings, but newer and up-and-coming companies like Snowflake and VMware, providing more niche cloud services, are also included in this ETF, so you don't have to worry about missing out on any cloud innovation. The expense ratio is relatively high at 0.6%, which is more than other ETFs, and the dividend yield is low at 0.3, which is lower than most other ETFs. But this is the thing with cloud computing and technology in general. Most of these companies reinvest their profits to grow the company even further. Massive growth potential still exists, and the biggest thing is the innovation that these companies bring. They bring industry leadership and also technological leadership, and cover a whole variety of topics like AI, big data, the Internet of Things, and communication on the internet. The biggest concerns here are, of course, that these companies are overvalued. If you look at the PE ratio for most of these companies, they're exorbitantly high. But that's just because the market expects them to deliver high growth in the future. Companies like Snowflake have a growth rate in the mid to high 20s, and the market expects them to grow at a similar rate, if not higher. And of course, this is not suitable for dividend investors because the dividend yield is extremely low. So if you're looking for consistent monthly cash flow, this is not going to be the ETF for you. You need to have thick skin if you want to invest in Sky, because there's going to be volatility, there's going to be risk, and some years this ETF might be down 30%, but that's why we gradually grew to this point. If you cannot tolerate this risk, you can invest in the S&P 500 and get lower risk, but still partake in the cloud revolution, because most of the companies like Amazon and Microsoft are still in the S&P 500 ETF. And you'll notice, in fact, that the performance of this ETF is very similar to the S&P 500, with it being up 14.55% annually over the last 10 years. This video, though, is forward-looking, so it just depends on what you think cloud computing is going to do from this point on. Now we've covered 4 ETFs gradually increasing risk, and the fifth and last one is going to completely wreck that trend, because the last ETF is ticker symbol VTI, or the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. This is a darling in investment communities online, and for good reason. This follows the CRSP US Total Market Index and includes not just large cap stocks, but also mid cap and small cap stocks. The focus is to be extremely broad and diversified, with it including over 4,000 stocks. 4,000. And since it includes 4,000 stocks, this is also extremely diversified when it comes to sector, although technology does make around 1/4 of the entire ETF. Healthcare, financials, and consumer defensive are also substantial holdings. The usual suspects are all there: Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, everybody's there. It's a party that includes everybody. And for me, the kicker is that the expense ratio is extremely low at 0.03%, while the dividend yield is also decent at 1.5%, something that we noticed that these extremely focused tech ETFs do not have. The long-term performance is extremely strong and closely correlated with the performance of the US economy, which is not a bad bet. But this is where the first caveat comes in. This is extremely US focused. If the US economy has a downturn, this ETF is going to take a big hit, because it doesn't matter if the company is a micro cap or small cap or large cap. If the economy is down, the ETF is going to be down. In other words, there is no international exposure. So if you're someone who thinks the international economy is going to do well in the coming years, you might want to look elsewhere. Although this has taken one financial crisis and the recent market drawdown that we had, and still returns 9% on average since 2001. That's 9% on average, showing you that it doesn't matter if the economy is down or up. If you invest for the long run, you can expect a 9% return on this ETF. So all in all, even though this return might not be that 12-13% return of the S&P 500 or the 16% return of the NASDAQ or potential 20% return of Sky, this gives you a strong baseline for your portfolio. For beginner investors that maybe are not used to volatility or risk and just want to dip their toes in the market, this might be the best option. And it's also extremely passive. Every time you have some money, you can just go buy VTI. The liquidity pool is extremely high, and you can watch those dividends drip and grow. So the basic question is, if that 3% per year return that you sacrifice by investing in VTI over the S&P 500, does that bring you more stability and more peace at night when you sleep? And if it does, then you have your answer. VTI is not a bad investment. Those were the 5 ETFs that are looking strong for 2025 given the performance of the US economy in the recent past. Of course, with stock investing comes a big risk, and all of these might be down 20% next year. Who knows? The biggest thing is to have an investment strategy and get started. It doesn't matter, like me, if you like these 5 ETFs or if you like some other ETFs or individual companies. Taking part in the stock market or investment vehicles is the key to building long-term wealth. And if you're in the US or in Canada or the developed world, it is extremely easy to get started. There's tons of brokers in the US, for example, providing free, commission-free trading. For example, Robinhood, even Fidelity and other companies have their own versions of extremely cheap trading platforms. When I started 2 years ago, I had the same feelings. What if I set up this account and link my bank and then I lose money? But over time, I've realized partaking in businesses, in companies that create value, is the real key to building wealth. Don't let your money stay on the sideline and take decent calculated risk. That is the lesson that I told myself, and I think I'm going to stick with it even for 2025. If you enjoyed this video, smash the like button and the subscribe button. Every subscriber helps get this video to the right people. Also interested in learning how to invest, save, and build wealth over time. I'll see you in the next one.